You have noticed, through mutual connections or through observing their behavior, that the avoidant appears unusually preoccupied with you after you walked away. That they ask about you with frequency that seems disproportionate given their patterns of apparent indifference, that they monitor your life through social media or through information gathering in ways they never monitored previous partners who they discarded easily, that they cannot seem to let you go or move on in the clean way they moved on from everyone who came before you. This obsessive quality confuses you because it contradicts everything you understood about avoidant psychology. You believed they preferred distance and would feel relieved when you finally stopped pursuing and removed yourself from their life. You expected your departure would allow them the defended comfort they seem to crave throughout relationship. You assumed walking away would make you forgettable to someone whose patterns suggested they never became deeply attached. Yet your walking away produced opposite effect from what avoidant psychology would predict. Instead of relief and easy moving on, instead of quickly replacing you with new person who will tolerate their patterns, instead of feeling comfortable in the distance your departure created, the avoidant has become obsessed with you in ways they never became obsessed with previous partners who they left or who they pushed away through their patterns. The obsession manifests through their inability to stop tracking your life, through their frequent mentions of you to mutual connections, through their apparent inability to form new connections that satisfy them the way they assumed new connections would, through their continued preoccupation with you months or years after you implemented your departure. This unusual fixation feels confusing because you wonder whether it indicates they have recognized what they lost, whether they have developed feelings they could not access while you were available, whether your walking away created the space that allowed them to miss you in ways your presence prevented. Yet the avoidance obsession with you stems not from suddenly recognizing your value or from developing capacity for genuine attachment. It stems from the unprecedented experience of being the one who was left rather than being the one who left, from encountering someone who refused to tolerate patterns everyone else accepted, from losing control over relationship ending they expected to manage on their timeline, from facing person who will not wait indefinitely, in ways their ego assumed you would wait. You are obsession not because you are special in ways they finally recognize. You are obsession because you are the exception who walked away when their entire relational history taught them. People do not walk away from them. People tolerate their patterns indefinitely. People wait available while they determine whether those people are worth their investment. Your walking away created narcissistic wound. Their defensive structure cannot heal through usual mechanisms, created unfinished business their psychology cannot categorize or dismiss, created loss they cannot manage through their typical defended strategies because you removed yourself before they could position themselves as the one who chose to end things. Walking away broke their pattern of controlling every relationship's ending. The avoidant has maintained specific pattern across all their previous relationships, where they controlled the ending. They determined when relationship had run its course. They decided when their patterns made continuation unsustainable. They chose the moment to withdraw finally and permanently. They managed the timing and the narrative of how relationship concluded. Even in relationships where the other person technically ended things, the avoidance patterns created the conditions that forced that ending, meaning they maintained indirect control over the outcome even when they were not the one who spoke the final words. This control over ending served crucial defensive function by allowing the avoidant to manage their exposure to abandonment and rejection. If they control when and how relationship ends, they never have to experience being left, never have to face being deemed inadequate and discarded, never have to feel the powerlessness of someone else choosing to remove themselves from the avoidance life. The control over endings operated through specific mechanisms the avoidant employed across their relationship history. They withdrew gradually until the other person had no choice but to leave or accept permanent state of disconnection. The avoidant did not have to actively end things because their withdrawal made continuation impossible, giving them plausible deniability that they ended relationship while achieving the same outcome. They behaved in ways that violated the other person's boundaries or needs, until that person reached breaking point and left. Again, the avoidant did not technically do the leaving, but their behavior controlled the outcome by making staying intolerable. They maintained enough minimal contact or provided enough occasional presence to keep previous partners waiting indefinitely. These partners never walked away because the avoidant's sporadic provision kept hope alive that more investment might eventually materialize, meaning the avoidant retained control through keeping those people perpetually available. Your walking away shattered this lifelong pattern of control by implementing ending on your timeline according to your assessment, rather than waiting for the avoidant to determine when relationship would conclude. You did not wait for them to withdraw so completely that continuation became impossible. You chose to leave while relationship still existed in some form. You did not tolerate their patterns until you reached breaking point where leaving was only option to preserve your sanity. You chose to leave as conscious decision about what you would and would not accept. You did not remain available waiting for them to decide whether you were worth their investment. You removed yourself definitively, communicating through your departure that you had assessed them and found them inadequate, rather than waiting for them to assess you. This reversal, where you became the one who left, the one who controlled the ending, the one who determined the relationship had run its course, created unprecedented experience in the avoidance relational history. The loss of control over the ending destabilizes the avoidance defensive structure because that structure organized around assumption they would always control relationship outcomes. The defenses that protected them from abandonment anxiety worked partly through ensuring they were never actually abandoned. They left before they could be left. They controlled endings before endings could be imposed on them. They maintained power position that prevented experiencing powerlessness of being discarded. Your walking away forced them to experience what their defenses were designed to prevent. They were left, they were deemed inadequate. They were discarded by someone who decided they were not worth continued investment. This experience penetrated their defenses in ways that typical relationship endings did not penetrate because typical endings occurred within their control, whereas your departure occurred outside their control. The broken pattern creates obsession specifically because the avoidant cannot integrate the experience into their existing defensive narrative. Their narrative positions them as person who chooses whether to invest in others, who determines whether relationships continue, who maintains power through their capacity to withdraw or engage according to their preferences. Your walking away contradicts this entire narrative by positioning you as person who chose not to invest in them, who determined relationship would not continue, who maintained power through your capacity to remove yourself despite their patterns expecting you to remain. The avoidant cannot dismiss this contradiction or rationalize it away using their usual mechanisms because your departure was too definitive, too clearly your choice, too obviously outside their control. The obsession represents the avoidant's attempt to restore control retroactively by remaining fixated on you, by monitoring your life, by maintaining psychological connection even after you implemented physical separation. If they can stay preoccupied with you, if they can continue tracking your movements, if they can maintain you as object of their attention, they preserve some sense of connection and control even though you removed yourself from their reach. The obsession allows them to feel they are choosing to think about you rather than facing that you chose to leave them. They reframe their fixation as their decision to remain interested, rather than acknowledging their fixation stems from being unable to accept that you controlled the ending by walking away. Understanding that walking away broke their pattern of controlling endings allows you to recognize their obsession stems from unprecedented loss of control, rather than from suddenly recognizing your value. You became obsession not because they finally see what they lost. You became obsession because you were first person who took control away from them by leaving on your terms rather than waiting for them to orchestrate ending on theirs. The obsession reflects their destabilized defensive structure, attempting to restore control over a situation where you definitively demonstrated they had no control over your choice to walk away. You became the exception who didn't tolerate what everyone else accepted. The avoidant has moved through their entire relationship history, encountering people who tolerated their patterns to varying degrees. Partners who accepted their withdrawal without implementing consequences, who accommodated their emotional unavailability while continuing to invest, who remained available despite sporadic contact and minimal effort, who waited patiently hoping the avoidant would eventually provide consistent presence. These previous partners established pattern the avoidant learned to expect. People tolerate defended limitations. People accept inadequate treatment if given occasional scraps of attention. People remain invested even when reciprocation is minimal. People do not leave even when patterns consistently demonstrate the avoidant cannot or will not meet basic relationship requirements. This learned expectation that people tolerate their patterns indefinitely created comfortable position where the avoidant never had to face genuine consequences for their defended behavior, never had to choose between maintaining patterns and maintaining relationship, never had to experience someone definitively refusing to accept treatment that fell below acceptable standards. You broke this pattern by refusing to tolerate what everyone else accepted. You did not remain patient indefinitely while they withdrew repeatedly. You established that repeated withdrawal would cost them your presence. You did not accept emotional unavailability as unfortunate limitation you must accommodate. You communicated that emotional unavailability made them inadequate partner you would not continue relationship with. You did not stay available during their sporadic contact, hoping they would eventually invest more consistently. You removed your availability when their investment proved inadequate. You did not wait for them to decide you were worth their effort. You decided they were not worth your continued tolerance, and you left. This refusal to accept what others accepted created unprecedented experience where the avoidant faced actual consequences for patterns that previously generated no consequences beyond complaints they could ignore. Your exceptionalism manifested through specific ways. Your behavior differed from the avoidant's previous partners. Previous partners complained about the avoidant's patterns, yet continued accepting those patterns. You stopped accepting patterns when complaints generated no change. Previous partners established boundaries verbally, yet failed to enforce those boundaries when the avoidant violated them. You enforced boundaries through action rather than through repeated verbal warnings. Previous partners threatened to leave if patterns continued, yet remained. Despite patterns continuing unchanged, you actually left when patterns demonstrated the avoidant would not or could not change. Previous partners sacrificed their needs, hoping their sacrifice would eventually generate reciprocation. You refused to continue sacrificing when reciprocation proved inconsistent or absent. These behavioral differences meant you were a fundamentally different type of partner than the avoidant had encountered previously. Someone whose actions matched their words, whose boundaries had teeth, whose tolerance had actual limits. The exceptionalism created cognitive dissonance for the avoidant because their entire defensive structure organized around assumption that people tolerate their patterns, that accommodation is unlimited, that they can maintain defended position without facing relationship loss. Your refusal to tolerate violated this core assumption and forced recognition that their patterns do cost them relationships with people who have standards, that accommodation is not unlimited when dealing with someone who values themselves, that maintaining defended position does result in loss when they encounter someone who will actually walk away rather than remaining indefinitely. This recognition could not be easily dismissed or rationalized because you did not just threaten to leave or complain about leaving. You actually implemented departure and maintained it despite any minimal contact attempts they made to restore your availability. The exceptional quality of your refusal to tolerate their patterns elevated you in their perception in ways that have nothing to do with your actual qualities and everything to do with their wounded ego. You became significant not because they suddenly recognized your worth. You became significant because you refused to accept treatment their ego assumed anyone would accept from them. Previous partners who tolerated everything confirmed the avoidance, ego-serving belief that they are valuable enough that people will accept inadequate treatment to maintain access to them. Your walking away challenged this ego-serving belief by demonstrating you were not willing to accept inadequate treatment, that access to them was not valuable enough to justify tolerating their patterns, that they were not special enough that you would sacrifice your standards to remain in relationship with them. The obsession with you as the exception serves to manage the threat your exceptionalism created to their ego and their defensive structure. by remaining obsessed with you, by continuing to track your life, by maintaining focus on you months or years after you left. The avoidant attempts to restore your significance to them in ways that protect their ego from facing that you found them insignificant enough to walk away from. The obsession allows them to reframe the dynamic. Instead of you walking away because they were inadequate, the obsession positions you as special person they cannot forget, as exception who got away, as one who mattered more than others. This reframing protects their ego from facing the simpler truth. You walked away because they were not good enough, and you refused to tolerate being treated inadequately. Understanding that you became exception who did not tolerate what others accepted allows you to recognize their obsession, reflects your unprecedented refusal to accept their patterns, rather than reflecting their suddenly developed capacity to value you appropriately. You are obsession because you were different from everyone else in your willingness to actually walk away rather than continuing to tolerate. This difference wounded their ego and violated their expectations in ways that keep you in their awareness when previous partners who tolerated everything fade easily from their concern. The obsession is not about you being special in ways they fail to recognize. The obsession is about you being the exception who refused to accept being treated as less than special, who walked away rather than accepting the inadequate treatment their patterns consistently provided. Their obsession stems from losing control over someone they expected to wait forever. The avoidant developed specific, comfortable assumption about you during the relationship. You were a person who would wait, who would remain patient indefinitely, who would accept their patterns without implementing actual consequences, who would stay available regardless of how inadequately they showed up. This assumption developed through your historical behavior, where you remained present during their withdrawals, accepted their explanations for their patterns, tolerated their inconsistency without leaving, continued investing even when reciprocation was minimal. The avoidant learned through experience that you were a safe person to take for granted, reliable presence they could withdraw from without losing, patient partner who would accept whatever minimal provision they offered. This learned assumption that you would wait forever created comfortable position where they never had to choose between you and their defended patterns. They could maintain patterns while keeping you available, could withdraw without fearing loss, could provide minimal effort while receiving your continued maximum investment. The assumption that you would wait forever allowed the avoidant to position you mentally as permanent backup option, as person who would remain accessible when they eventually decided whether you were worth their full investment, a safe choice they could return to if other options proved unsatisfying. You were not priority they needed to act on urgently. You were a reliable constant they could afford to take time deciding about because you had demonstrated through your patience that you would wait for their decision rather than making your own decision to leave. This mental positioning meant the avoidant felt no urgency about improving their behavior or about meeting your needs more adequately because they assumed you would remain available indefinitely pending their eventual determination of whether relationship with you was what they wanted. Your walking away shattered the assumption that you would wait forever by demonstrating you had limits to your patience, that your tolerance was not unlimited, that you would make your own decision to leave, rather than waiting indefinitely for them to decide whether you were worth choosing. This shattering occurred suddenly from the avoidance perspective, even if your decision to leave resulted from a long process of recognizing their patterns would not change. The avoidant was not tracking your growing disillusionment or your approaching limit because they assumed your limit did not exist. Your departure arrived as shock that contradicted everything their experience with you had taught them to expect about your unlimited patience and your permanent availability. The loss of control over someone they expected to wait forever creates a specific form of obsession rooted in the avoidant's inability to accept that you removed yourself from their control. They controlled the relationship while you were present by managing distance, by determining level of investment, by choosing when to engage and when to withdraw. Your walking away eliminated all their control. They cannot manage distance because you created permanent distance. They cannot determine investment level because you removed all investment. They cannot choose when to engage because you made yourself unavailable to their engagement. This complete loss of control over someone they assumed they controlled through your patience and your continued availability creates crisis their defensive structure struggles to manage. The obsession represents attempt to restore psychological control even though actual control is gone. By remaining fixated on you, by tracking your life, by maintaining mental connection, the avoidant preserves feeling of connection and potential control even though you have removed yourself completely. The obsession allows them to believe relationship is not entirely over, that possibility remains for reconnection, that they still have some claim on your attention and your awareness. This believed ongoing connection serves to manage the intolerable feeling that you are completely beyond their control, that you made final decision they cannot influence, that you removed yourself definitively rather than remaining in pattern of waiting they expected would continue indefinitely. The obsession particularly intensifies when the avoidant observes you not waiting. When they see you moving forward with your life, building new connections, appearing happy without them, demonstrating through your behavior that you genuinely walked away rather than positioning yourself at distance, hoping they will pursue you. These observations contradict their assumption that you would wait and force recognition, that you truly removed yourself from availability to them. Yet instead of accepting this recognition and moving forward themselves, the obsession deepens as the avoidant cannot integrate the reality that you are not waiting into their defensive structure that organized around assumption you would always wait. The loss of someone they expected to wait forever wounds the avoidant's ego, specifically because it reveals they were not important enough to you to justify unlimited waiting. Previous partners who waited indefinitely confirm the avoidant's ego-serving belief that they are valuable enough that people will remain patient forever, hoping for their full investment. Your walking away challenged this belief by demonstrating you assessed their value and determined it was not sufficient to justify continued waiting, that they were not worth sacrificing your life to remain available for, that their eventual decision about whether you were worth choosing became irrelevant because you decided they were not worth waiting for. This ego wound cannot be healed through usual defensive mechanisms because you are not available to provide reassurance or to return to waiting position that would restore their sense of being valuable enough that people wait indefinitely for them. Understanding that obsession stems from losing control over someone they expected to wait forever allows you to recognize their fixation reflects their wounded ego and their destabilized sense of control, rather than reflecting genuine recognition of what they lost. You became obsession not because they suddenly realized you were worth choosing. You became obsession because you refused to keep waiting for them to choose you, because you took yourself off the permanent available list they assumed you would remain on indefinitely, because you demonstrated they were not important enough to you to justify waiting forever in ways their ego cannot accept. The obsession is an attempt to restore sense of control and importance by remaining focused on you even though you removed yourself from their actual control by walking away when they expected you to wait. You're the unfinished business their defensive structure can't categorize or dismiss. The avoidance defensive structure includes specific mechanisms for categorizing and dismissing previous partners once relationships end. They focus on those partners' flaws to justify the ending. They rationalize why relationship was not right fit. They deactivate their attachment by emphasizing incompatibilities. They mentally file the person away as past chapter that is closed and no longer relevant. These defensive categorization mechanisms allow the avoidant to move forward without ongoing preoccupation with previous partners, to avoid processing grief or regret about ended relationships, to maintain comfortable narrative where endings were inevitable and appropriate. The mechanisms work effectively with partners who tolerated their patterns until the avoidant withdrew completely, or until those partners finally left after extended period of inadequate treatment. These conventional endings fit easily into defensive categories the avoidant has developed for managing relationship conclusions. Your walking away created ending that does not fit into the avoidant's existing defensive categories that cannot be easily rationalized or dismissed using their usual mechanisms. You did not tolerate their patterns until natural deterioration occurred. You left while relationships still had some vitality, making the ending feel premature rather than inevitable. You did not wait until you reached breaking point where leaving was only option. You chose to leave as empowered decision rather than as desperate escape, making the ending feel like your choice rather than like necessary conclusion to unsustainable situation. You did not leave with obvious flaws they can focus on to justify your departure. You left with your dignity intact, with your standards enforced, with clear message that their patterns were inadequate rather than that you were inadequate. This atypical ending cannot be processed through the defensive mechanisms that worked for processing typical endings. The unfinished quality stems from the avoidant never getting to complete their usual relationship arc with you. In typical pattern, the avoidant maintains relationship until they have fully deactivated, until they have mentally processed that relationship will not work, until they have prepared themselves psychologically for ending, even if the other person technically implements that ending. This internal completion allows them to feel finished with the relationship and the person, to categorize the ended relationship as concluded chapter, to move forward without ongoing psychological entanglement. Your walking away occurred before they completed this internal process. You left while they still had some activation toward you, while they had not fully decided relationship was over, while they were still in their typical pattern of taking you for granted, while assuming you would remain available. The ending arrived before they were psychologically ready for ending, leaving them with activated feelings and unresolved process they cannot complete because you are no longer available to complete it with. The defensive structure cannot dismiss you using typical mechanisms because those mechanisms rely on specific narratives that do not apply to your departure. The avoidant typically dismisses previous partners by focusing on those partners' excessive needs, those partners' emotional demands, those partners' inability to accept the avoidant as they are. This dismissal frames the ended relationship as a result of partners' inadequacy or incompatibility, rather than as a result of the avoidance patterns. Yet you walked away not because you had excessive needs, you walked away because they could not meet basic legitimate needs. You left not because you made emotional demands, you left because they could not provide basic emotional availability. You departed not because you could not accept them, you left because accepting them would require accepting inadequate treatment. The usual dismissal narratives do not work because the ending clearly resulted from their inadequacy rather than from yours. The unfinished business also stems from your walking away, preventing the avoidant from positioning themselves as the one who determined the relationship's fate. In typical endings, the avoidant maintains sense that they chose the outcome even when the other person technically left. Their patterns created the conditions that forced leaving, giving them sense of control over the conclusion. Your walking away as clear choice before they were ready removes their ability to claim they controlled the outcome, leaves them with uncomfortable reality that you chose to end things, creates unresolved psychological position where they were left rather than being the leaver. This reverse position cannot be easily integrated into defensive structure that organizes around them maintaining control over relationship outcomes. The inability to categorize or dismiss you creates ongoing psychological irritation, where you remain active in their awareness when previous partners have faded into dismissed past. The avoidant finds themselves thinking about you when they do not think about previous partners, finds themselves unable to move on cleanly the way they moved on from relationships that ended in typical ways, finds themselves preoccupied with unfinished quality of how things ended rather than feeling finished the way their defensive mechanisms typically allow them to feel. This ongoing preoccupation constitutes the obsession. You remain psychologically active and unresolved when their defensive structure would prefer you to be categorized and dismissed like everyone who came before.